After Anytus leaves the gymnasium, Meno confides to Socrates that he's really not sure at all about whether virtue was taught. Even among the sophists, he admits, some of them say that their aim is to teach virtue, while others, like Gorgias, laugh at the very idea that virtue can be taught, and instead simply focus on teaching their students how to speak well and cleverly, how to persuade, how to win arguments no matter what is said. In other words, how to be successful in whatever area or ambition they've chosen for themselves. How much, then, are modern-day teachers expected to be like Gorgias, Aren't we looked to by parents to help cultivate in their children the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary for their success? Certainly, we're tasked with helping students to discover their dreams, their goals, and their ambitions. Moreover, we're given the responsibility of developing in them certain capacities, or perhaps even delivering to them the tools whereby, following the mandated curricular outcomes of the various programs of study, each student might exert his or her efforts towards the successful achievement of those self-chosen dreams and goals. But this is essentially sophistic education. This is the education offered by Gorgias in the 4th and 5th centuries BC. Even though our modern school studies go by the name of academics, and even though our academies of today get their name from Plato's original academy, initially a sacred grove of olive trees just outside the city dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom, the root of our schools lies not with Socrates, nor does it lie with Plato, but stems instead from men like Gorgias and the Sophists. The deep question I would have you ponder as we move through Plato's Meno is something like this. How will you bring the inquisitive spirit of philosophy or wisdom's pursuit back into the schools by means of your own teaching? How will you not simply concern yourself with perfecting the sophist's art as a teacher, with learning how to prep your kids successfully for the big 50% exams and the PATs or the SLAs or whatever new name they choose to call such things by? How will you not simply resign yourself to abiding in the sophist's mandate to teach, or in the government's accountability structures about what constitutes good teaching or a good school? Say, having high rankings in the Fraser Institute's annual report. Will you have the courage to teach like Socrates? Will you have the courage to inquire in a way that doesn't puff your students up with knowledge ostensibly demonstrated on their exams, but that might well lead them in the opposite direction? What if in teaching your students to inquire, they come like Meno to discover that they don't know? What if this great and wonderful discovery via inquiry leads not to higher test scores, but to lower ones? What is the true measure of success in education? A masterful demonstration of knowledge? Or coming to know the extent of one's own ignorance? In short, do you have the courage to lead your students in a kind of teaching and inquiry that might render problematic all the marks and the grading systems and accountability structures around teaching? Do you want to kick that hornet's nest? These and like tough questions are the challenges that Socrates offers us when we read his words in Plato's dialogues. Well, in response to Meno's question about just how anyone ever learns to become a decent human being if nobody seems to be able to teach virtue, and if virtue isn't something that people just have by birthright, Socrates suggests that there are a few different ways to understand this problem. He uses the provocative image of a man walking down the road, not knowing the way to where he's going, and who decides to ask two different men for directions. One of the men has first-hand personal and experiential knowledge of how to get to the requested destination point. He's been there before, and he can give the traveler who is lost some very good directions for this reason. The other man has never been there before, but he's been told how to get there. And who knows, maybe he even has a map of how to get there. Anyway, he too can guide the lost traveler on his way, not because of any first-hand knowledge, and here the Greek word for knowledge is episteme, about the place, but rather because he harbors a right opinion of how to get there. And the words for right opinion, incidentally, are orthodoxos, which, that's where we get our word orthodoxy. Both orthodoxy or right opinion and knowledge get you where you need to go. And so, perhaps part of what makes the world go round and allows folks to live reasonable lives around each other isn't necessarily that they have cultivated a clear knowledge of what is, but rather, somewhere along the line, they've luckily picked up some right views about things. That, incidentally, is the power behind tradition and custom and cultural understandings. Now, such things aren't exactly knowledge. In fact, mixed into traditions and customs, we're certain to find some pretty nutty things at times. But traditions and customs and cultural practices are powerful carriers for right opinion in society. They allow huge masses of folks to live reasonably decent lives with reasonably decent rules and ideas about how to get on in a reasonable fashion in the world without being, inclined necessarily to dialectic or to inquiry. Without knowledge, right opinion will still get you where you need to go. Now this, it seems to me, is a big relief. But Socrates also points out one of the pitfalls of right opinion, and the inculcation of right opinion perhaps through schooling. Namely, right opinion, unlike knowledge, doesn't stick easily. He compares right opinion to those crazy statues carved by Daedalus that, unless they're chained to the floor, get up and run away. So, when we teach right opinions to children in schools, we need to make sure we chain down our crazy statues by also reflecting with students on why these opinions, customs, or traditions are good ones. And even then, right opinion is never as secure as knowledge. As Socrates puts it, knowledge differs from right opinion by its bond. Here, too, is a good question for you to ask yourself as a wannabe school teacher or a teacher in training. How are we expected to teach in schools today? If schools, by and large, may not at all be interested in the sort of inquiry that Socrates practices, but are rather more after the sophistic model, how genuine is their commitment to knowledge? Contrary to this, given that Canadian society is now pluralistic and multicultural, and given the manner in which traditions and customs are eyed pretty suspiciously as not instruments of right opinion, but rather very often as tools for oppression and discrimination and control. Given the way that nowadays we seem to mistrust the notion that orthodoxies ever have any value at all, and yet in the past such orthodoxies were indeed the best carriers we had in society for social order and stability and living a reasonable life in the absence of true knowledge. How are we to make out what we must do as educators? We can't simply teach tradition, it seems, or even why traditions are important and good, because tradition is an affront to some, if not many, people in a multicultural society. You're going to find lots of parents like that. This seems to be particularly the case in Alberta, where we must provide waivers to parents, announcing beforehand any intentions we might have to explore the great traditions and world religions with our students in public school, exposing them to such things and talking about why they are of any value. That's the chain around the statue. I said earlier how I find Socrates' words about the benefits of both knowledge and orthodoxy comforting. And yet, I confess, it leaves me a bit puzzled and vexed myself as to how we might as teachers proceed in a modern-day school system that cannot decide what it thinks about the pursuit of wisdom on the one hand and the teaching of right opinion on the other. Perhaps time will tell. Well, the dialogue ends with a kind of summation of findings, namely, that it seems from the hypothetical investigations of Meno and Socrates that virtue is neither something that is taught, nor is it something that we have by nature or from birth. If virtue does come to us, Socrates suggests to Meno, then it must come via some kind of divine apportionment, or thea moira. Virtue is, simply put, a kind of gift of the god. It comes to whoever it comes through divine dispensation. This statement by Socrates at the end of the dialogue, made twice in very short succession, by the way, it probably sits pretty well with some of you, for whom your own traditions have provided a space for such teachings. But for others among us, statements about divine apportionment might cause alarm. They might seem a bit preposterous. Who knows? There may be some of you who are offended by such things. Often that seems to be the case. There is, however, no room in philosophy for offense-taking, only for inquiry. Let me, therefore, attempt to explain this image of divine apportionment in a way that might assuage some of your fears and concerns. Maybe not in any immediate way, but perhaps in a manner that years from now, as you continue to teach and to think and to inquire, it might be of some value to you in your expanding searches. The essential point behind describing virtue to thea moira, divine apportionment, can be understood if we recall what we already know from earlier in the dialogue about recollection or anamnesis. We remember, according to these images, that human beings, along with all else that is, are part of a grand cosmic order, a universe, and that the Greeks spoke of this order, or cosmos, as being good. In fact, that's what the word cosmos means, good order. So for that matter, does our word universe, for the universe is everything together as it turns around that one axis that is good, that is the good ground and source for all order and all that is. Mind you, the goodness of the cosmic order isn't always readily apparent to us, and being able to see its goodness can take some hard work and practice, to say the least. In Shakespeare's time, as in the days of Pythagoras, people still spoke of the music of the spheres, a kind of inaudible cosmic music that we could hear in our hearts if only we were open and attuned enough to the resonance of the universal order of things. Often we ourselves are full of ignorance about such things. Mostly, the order we see in things is very partial. Often all we see appears very chaotic. And even more often, many folks tell us nowadays that there is no order in the world, that human beings have to make that order. That order is a product of our own wills, pounding things into the shape we demand. That there is no good and evil in the world apart from the things that we do and the things that we say are good and evil. Often, in other words, we can't see very well at all. Can't espy any cosmos anywhere. Our minds are filled with confusion. or our souls are disordered in various ways. But the Greeks tell us that any goodness that we manage to discover in the world, any goodness that we can come to be able to see in the world, in ourselves or in each other, comes through our being reminded or recollecting that grand order, and for that matter, from recalling that greatest good or that ground of being in which the entire cosmos must itself participate in order for anything in it at all to be good in the first place. And when we see this little bit of what is good, or when we experience something beautiful, or something true, we're stricken with love for that which we've seen. We're filled with eros, or desire for it. This is our response to the goodness, beauty, or truth we see wherever we see it. This love we feel as lovers is therefore dependent upon the existence of our beloved, in whom we have seen the beautiful, and through whom we are reminded of beauty itself. Our love, in other words, is a response, conditioned by the existence of the fact of there being that which is lovable in the first place. And not just this or that lovable instance of goodness, truth, or beauty. For all good and beautiful and true things are good and true and beautiful in their own way, but also perhaps fraught in other ways with a lack of what is good or beautiful or true. They're finitely good or true or beautiful. But each of them, in its various way, might serve as a springboard for knowing reality as such, for knowing and loving and seeing the whole, like William Blake says in his poem, Auguries of Innocence. He writes, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity at the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." In other words, not only our love of goodness, but the goodness of what is, that grand cosmic goodness in which we all participate. None of that's our making. It's already there. And we but merely discover it. We but merely recollect it. It's always there. It's always been there. And it's a gift we didn't earn. It's just given to us, as it's given to everything that participates in the cosmic order. Our job as teachers is, in some sense, to help our students to see the world in that grain of sand, and to see eternity in an hour, and to appreciate the beautiful goodness of the world and of their own being, and to hear that music of the spheres of which Shakespeare writes in his Merchant of Venice. What a wonderful profession you've chosen as teachers. I wish you the very best.